What if the horror movies you love weren't just stories? What if the nightmares on screen were real, born from true events? Real victims, and unspeakable evil that once walked this earth? From demonic possessions to haunted houses that drove families insane. These films weren't created by imagination alone, they were inspired by reality. Tonight, we dive deep into the shadows behind Hollywood's most chilling legends. These are 10 horror movies based on terrifying true stories, where truth is more horrifying than fiction. So dim the lights, hold your breath, and before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Movie Mysteries, because after this, you may never watch, based on a true story, the same way again. 1. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, 2005, the true story behind a possession that shook the world. When The Exorcism of Emily Rose hit theaters in 2005, audiences thought they were watching another Hollywood exorcism flick, screaming, shaking, holy water flying everywhere, but few realized the movie was based on a horrifying real-life case that ended not in redemption, but in tragedy. The film tells the story of a young college girl, Emily, who becomes possessed by dark forces, or so her family believes. Doctors call it psychosis. A priest calls it the devil. The courtroom becomes the battlefield between faith and science. But behind the script lies the real story of Anneliese Michel, a 23-year-old German woman whose life became one of the most controversial exorcism cases in modern history. Anneliese was a devout Catholic. She prayed daily, attended Mass, and dreamed of serving God. But in her early 20s, something changed. She began hearing voices, terrifying, blasphemous whispers telling her she was damned. Her body convulsed violently, her face twisted in agony. Doctors diagnosed her with epilepsy and depression, but no treatment worked. When her parents turned to the church for help, 2 priests were authorized to perform an exorcism. What followed were 67 sessions over 10 months, each lasting hours. Each recorded on tape. In those chilling tapes, you can still hear Anneliese's voice, guttural, animalistic, claiming to be multiple demons at once, including Lucifer himself. By the time the rituals ended, Anneliese was dead, starved, bruised, and broken. Her death led to a criminal trial that shocked Europe. The priests were charged with negligent homicide. And the question of faith versus science was thrust into the global spotlight. Director Scott Derrickson took this story and turned it into something hauntingly balanced, not just a horror film, but a courtroom drama that forces viewers to confront a disturbing question. Was Emily Rose truly possessed, or was she destroyed by belief itself? The movie's realism hits deep because it never gives you a clear answer. It leaves you trapped between logic and the supernatural, exactly where Anneliese's family once stood. Many audiences reported sleepless nights after watching it. Some claimed strange sounds in their homes. Others felt something watching them after the final scene. Even the actors spoke about a heavy presence during filming. Whether you believe in possession or not, The Exorcism of Emily Rose blurs the line between faith, fear, and madness. It isn't just a movie, it's a reminder that some stories are too dark to stay buried. And this was only the beginning. 2. The Amityville Horror, 1979. The House That Evil Never Left. When you think of haunted houses, this is the one that started it all. A quiet suburban home on 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York, white siding, red shutters, and those infamous windows staring out like something alive. It looks peaceful until you learn what happened inside. The Amityville Horror, 1979, wasn't just a film. It was a cultural earthquake. It told the story of George and Kathy Lutz, a young couple who moved into a beautiful riverside home, only to flee in terror 28 days later. They claimed the house was infested with evil. Bleeding walls, swarms of flies, voices in the night, and most chilling of all, the dark energy left behind by a mass murder. Just a year before the Lutz family moved in, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had brutally shot and killed 6 members of his own family, his parents and 4 siblings, while they slept in that same house. When police arrived, he calmly confessed, saying, "The voices made me do it. The murders were real. The crime scene was real. And when George and Kathy Lutz bought the house at a bargain price, they thought they were getting a dream home. Instead, they found themselves living a nightmare. According to their accounts, strange events began immediately. Doors slammed by themselves. Mysterious cold spots appeared. A hidden room, painted entirely red, was discovered behind a basement wall. The dog refused to go near it. And George began waking up every night at 3:15 a.m., the exact time the murders had occurred. They called in a priest to bless the home. He fled after hearing a demonic voice growl, "Get out!" Within a month, the Lutz family escaped, leaving behind all their belongings and never returning. When the movie hit theaters in 1979, it terrified audiences not just because of the scares, but because it was said to be true. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and people across America began asking, could a house really be evil? Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, a clever publicity stunt by the Lutz family and author Jay Anson, who wrote the best-selling book that inspired the film. But believers point to the long history of strange happenings that continued in that house, new owners reporting shadows, cold drafts, and eerie sensations that couldn't be explained. Even to this day, the Amityville house attracts ghost hunters and thrill seekers who swear they can still feel something watching from the upstairs windows. Those crescent-shaped windows, like two eyes that never blink. The Amityville horror didn't just scare audiences. It created an entire subgenre of, based on a true haunting, movies, paving the way for The Conjuring, Insidious, and countless others. But nothing has ever matched the sheer dread of that house, the one where evil supposedly still lingers. Because whether you believe the story or not, some places feel alive, and some homes never let go. 3. The Conjuring, 2013, the haunting that shook the real Ed and Lorraine Warren. Before The Conjuring became one of the highest-grossing horror franchises in history, it was a true story. And it didn't start in Hollywood, it started in a lonely farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, where a family of 7 found themselves face to face with something they couldn't explain, and couldn't escape. The year was 1971. Roger and Carolyn Perron had just moved into a sprawling, old farmhouse with their 5 daughters. It was everything they dreamed of, quiet, spacious, full of history. But sometimes, history refuses to stay buried. Almost immediately, strange things began to happen. The children saw figures standing in the dark. Doors creaked open on their own. And every night, the family could hear clapping sounds echoing through the hallways, when no one was there. Then came the smell, rotting flesh. The lights flickering. The feeling of being watched. Always watched. Terrified and desperate, the Perrons contacted 2 of the most famous paranormal investigators in America, Ed and Lorraine Warren. If those names sound familiar, it's because their real-life cases inspired Annabelle, The Nun, and many other films that built the Conjuring universe. When the Warrens arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't just a haunting. It was something darker. According to their investigation, the house had once belonged to a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, accused of witchcraft in the 1800s, and rumored to have sacrificed her own child to the devil. Local legend claimed her spirit still haunted the property, cursing anyone who dared to live there. Lorraine later said the house was infested with malevolent energy. And that energy seemed to target Carolyn, the mother. She would wake up with bruises, hear voices whispering her name, even see a twisted figure standing beside her bed. Then, the unthinkable, she began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own. The Warrens performed a séance, not a full exorcism, but a desperate attempt to drive the spirit out. What happened that night was so terrifying that the Perron family refused to ever speak of it again in detail. Furniture levitated. Carolyn's body contorted. And for a moment, everyone in the room thought she might die right there. When The Conjuring hit theaters in 2013, critics praised it for its old-school horror, no cheap CGI. Just pure atmosphere and dread. But what really shook audiences was the reminder that this wasn't just a story. It was based on real events. And Lorraine Warren herself, now an elderly widow, personally approved every detail shown in the movie. Even now, decades later, the Perron daughters insist the haunting truly happened. They say the spirits never really left, they just went quiet. Waiting. And that's what makes The Conjuring so deeply terrifying. Because when the credits roll and the lights come back on, you can't shake the thought that somewhere out there, in another old house, it could all happen again. 4. Annabelle, 2014. The doll that should never have been touched. Before Annabelle became a horror icon, sealed behind glass at the Warren Museum, she was just a doll, a gift meant to bring joy. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most innocent faces. It began in 1970, when two young nurses, Donna and Angie, received a strange gift. A large, vintage Raggedy Ann doll. It looked harmless, almost cute, with its stitched smile and red yarn hair. They placed it in their apartment, never imagining it would become a doorway to something sinister. At first, it was little things. The doll seemed to change positions. Its arms would be in a different place. Its head slightly turned. Notes began appearing around the apartment, handwritten messages scrawled on parchment paper that the girls didn't even own. Then came the sounds. Scratching in the middle of the night. Footsteps when no one else was home. Terrified, the girls contacted a medium. What she told them made their blood run cold. The spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins had supposedly died on the property years earlier, and wanted to inhabit the doll to be close to the living again. Feeling sympathy, Donna gave the spirit permission. That's when the real nightmare began. The activity escalated violently. One of their friends woke up in the middle of the night with deep claw marks across his chest. Objects flew across the room. And the doll seemed to move, not just shift positions, but move. Desperate, they reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the same paranormal investigators from The Conjuring. When the Warrens arrived, they immediately sensed something far darker than a child's ghost. As Lorraine would later explain, it wasn't a little girl at all, it was an inhuman spirit. A demon pretending to be innocent. According to their findings, the entity had attached itself to the doll as a conduit, manipulating the nurses' emotions. Gaining their trust, and growing stronger with every ounce of fear and compassion they gave it. The Warrens performed a series of blessings and took the doll away. But even after it was sealed in a blessed glass case, strange things continued to happen. Visitors who mocked the doll or tapped on the glass often experienced car accidents or freak misfortunes on their way home. To this day, Annabelle remains locked inside the Occult Museum in Connecticut. A priest blesses the case weekly. And a sign sits right beside it, reading in bold letters. Warning. Positively do not open. What makes Annabelle so chilling isn't the porcelain doll in the movie, it's that somewhere, right now, the real one still exists. Sitting silently, watching, and waiting for someone foolish enough to open her case again. 5. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, inspired by a killer who wore human skin. Before the roaring chainsaw and the shrieks of terror echoed through drive-in theaters, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was more than just a horror film, it was a nightmare rooted in truth. The story follows a group of friends who stumble upon a deranged family in rural Texas. Led by the grotesque, mask-wearing butcher known as Leatherface. What many viewers didn't know was that the inspiration behind this film was far more disturbing than anything on screen. The seed of horror was planted by the real-life monster Ed Gein, a quiet man from Plainfield, Wisconsin. In the 1950s, the town saw him as strange, maybe lonely, but harmless. No one knew that inside his isolated farmhouse, Gein was building something unimaginable. When police entered his home in 1957, they uncovered a scene straight out of hell. Chairs upholstered with human skin. Masks made from human faces. A belt crafted out of severed nipples. And bowls made from skulls. Gein had been robbing graves and killing, using the bodies to create grotesque souvenirs, in a twisted attempt to resurrect his dead mother. Director Tobe Hooper took those gruesome fragments of truth and molded them into Leatherface, a character who wore the skin of his victims, hiding behind flesh to mask his own shattered identity. The movie's raw, Documentary-like realism made audiences believe they were watching something real. And in a way, they were. When it premiered in 1974, people fainted, screamed, and even vomited in theaters. It was banned in several countries, not because of excessive gore, there was actually very little blood on screen, but because of the unrelenting dread that crawled under your skin and refused to leave. Hooper's low-budget handheld camera work, the suffocating heat, and the claustrophobic Texas landscape made it feel too real. And that's the genius of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It wasn't just about Leatherface. It was about the decay of humanity itself, a reflection of post-Vietnam America, where people feared that monsters no longer lived in the shadows, but in plain sight. Even today, almost 50 years later, the film still feels disturbingly authentic. The chainsaw's roar, the screeching sound of metal on bone, the flicker of terror in Sally's eyes as she runs through the woods, all burned into the collective memory of horror fans forever. And knowing it was inspired by a man who really existed, a man who really wore the skin of his victims, makes it even more horrifying. Because the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't just a movie. It's a mirror, showing us how easily an ordinary man can become a monster when the human soul begins to rot. 6. Psycho, 1960. The real killer who haunted Hitchcock's mind. Before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre terrified audiences with its brutality, there was Psycho, a film that quietly redefined fear. It began with a lonely motel on a deserted highway and a shy, soft-spoken man named Norman Bates. To travelers, he was polite, gentle, even kind, but behind that uneasy smile, something darker was waiting. When Psycho premiered in 1960, it shocked the world. The infamous shower scene, the haunting violins, and that final twist, all became part of cinematic legend. But what most people didn't realize was that this horror masterpiece was inspired by a real person. Director Alfred Hitchcock based Norman Bates on Ed Gein, a reclusive farmer from Plainfield, Wisconsin. When police entered Gein's farmhouse in 1957, they stepped into a nightmare. Human bones turned into furniture, skulls used as bowls, masks stitched from the skin of the dead. Gein lived alone, except for the preserved body of his mother, whom he couldn't bear to let go. That twisted obsession, the inability to separate love from horror, became the very soul of Norman Bates. Hitchcock transformed Gein's madness into something far more chilling, a man torn between guilt, love, and psychosis. Norman's every word, every nervous laugh, every glance at mother, reflected the real-life horror of Ed Gein's disturbed mind. Psycho didn't just scare people, it shattered the rules of filmmaking. No hero was safe, no moment predictable, and no viewer ever looked at a shower the same way again. Over 60 years later, Psycho still crawls under your skin, whispering one chilling truth. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who seem the most ordinary. 7. The Exorcist, 1973. The film so terrifying, people fainted in theaters. Before CGI, before jump scares became formula, there was one film that didn't just scare people. It shattered them. When The Exorcist hit theaters in 1973, audiences screamed, fainted, even ran out crying. Ambulances waited outside cinemas, and priests were called in to bless the screenings. This wasn't just a movie, it was an experience that made people question faith, evil, and the fragile line between sanity and possession. At its core was a simple, devastating story, a mother's desperate attempt to save her 12-year-old daughter. Regan McNeil was a bright, happy girl, until strange voices began whispering from her room. Furniture moved by itself, shadows crawled across the ceiling. And what started as innocent play with a Ouija board soon became something far more sinister. The film's director, William Friedkin, was obsessed with realism. He wanted terror to feel real, not acted. He fired guns on set to startle the actors, chilled rooms to freezing temperatures so their breath would fog naturally, and even slapped one actor to get a genuine reaction. The result was raw, disturbing, unforgettable. But what truly made The Exorcist legendary was the claim that it was based on a true story. Back in 1949, a boy from Maryland, known only as Roland Doe, became the center of one of the most documented exorcisms in modern history. Witnesses described his bed shaking violently, furniture flying across the room, and words like evil and hell mysteriously carved into his skin. Priests claimed to see objects move on their own. The boy would speak in Latin, a language he had never learned. And when the ritual finally ended, the room fell silent, leaving those present convinced they had faced something not of this world. Screenwriter William Peter Blatty, a Georgetown graduate, discovered this case and turned it into his novel The Exorcist, blending fact with faith and horror with heartbreak. He asked one haunting question: what happens when science can't explain the darkness inside us? The movie became more than just a horror classic. It was a mirror held up to humanity's oldest fear, that evil doesn't live in distant myths or ghost stories. It lives inside us. Even today, The Exorcist retains its dreadful power. Every spinning head, every guttural growl, every flash of those demonic eyes reminds us. No matter how advanced we become, some horrors remain beyond reason. Because evil doesn't need to hide in the dark, sometimes. It lives in the heart of a child, whispering softly, "I'm not finished yet." 8. The Girl Next Door, 2007. The horror that really happened. Some horror movies are scary because of monsters, demons, or ghosts. But sometimes, the most terrifying evil comes from ordinary people, people who smile, wave hello, and live right next door. The Girl Next Door isn't just another disturbing movie. It's based on one of the most horrifying true crimes in American history, a story so dark, so heartbreaking, that even decades later, it feels impossible to believe it really happened. The film begins like any other coming-of-age story. Two teenage sisters, Meg and Susan, move in with their aunt after losing their parents. At first, the neighborhood feels safe, kids playing baseball, summer sunlight, the warmth of suburbia. But behind that perfect facade, something unspeakable is waiting. Their aunt, Ruth Chandler, played chillingly by Blanche Baker, starts showing a disturbing favoritism toward the neighborhood boys. She lets them hang out in her basement, drinks beer with them, and slowly begins to lose her grip on sanity. Her jealousy of Meg's beauty turns to cruelty. Her cruelty becomes obsession. And soon, that basement, once a place of childish games, turns into a dungeon of suffering. What follows is almost unbearable. Meg is tied up, beaten, starved, and tortured, not by strangers, but by people who knew her. The other kids laugh, join in, and watch. It's a horror born not from the supernatural, but from the human heart at its absolute worst. And here's the part that truly chills the soul. It's based on the real-life murder of Sylvia Likens, a 16-year-old girl from Indiana in 1965. Sylvia was left in the care of a woman named Gertrude Baniszewski, who, along with her children and several neighborhood kids, brutally tortured her for months. They burned her skin. They carved words into her body. They made her believe she deserved it. And through it all, no one came to help. When police finally discovered Sylvia's body, they found her covered in scars, bruises, and messages written into her flesh. She died alone, in a locked basement, only feet away from people who could have saved her. The Girl Next Door doesn't use special effects or ghosts to scare you. It doesn't need to. Because every scream, every moment of pain, every horrifying act in that film, all of it, echoes something that really happened. It forces us to confront an awful truth. That the real monsters aren't born in haunted houses or graveyards. They grow up in neighborhoods, behind white fences, smiling as they wave good morning. And when the credits roll, the fear doesn't fade, it lingers. Because this time, evil didn't come from a nightmare. It came from a home that could have been yours. 9. The Entity, 1982. The true story of a woman haunted by the unseen. There are ghosts that rattle chains, shadows that creep across walls. And then there are forces that strike where no one can see, violent, invisible, and unstoppable. The Entity, 1982, isn't your average haunted house movie. It's based on the real-life case of Doris Bither, a woman from California who claimed she was physically and sexually attacked by an unseen spirit, not once, but over and over again. Her story was so shocking that even paranormal investigators, hardened by years of ghost hunting, were left speechless. The film follows Carla Moran, played by Barbara Hershey, a single mother just trying to raise her children after a tough divorce. Her life is ordinary, until one night, everything changes. An invisible force slams her against the bed. Her screams echo through the house. But there's no one there. No intruder, no explanation. Only bruises and terror. At first, Carla doubts her own sanity. Is she losing her mind? But when her children witness the attacks, and objects begin to move on their own, the truth becomes undeniable. Something, or someone, is in that house with them. Desperate, Carla turns to a team of scientists and parapsychologists at UCLA. They set up cameras, sensors, and high-tech recording equipment throughout her home. They expect nothing. But what they capture defies belief. According to the real investigators, strange lights appeared out of nowhere. A glowing mist formed above Doris's bed. And in one horrifying moment, a spectral figure seemed to take shape in front of them. The case became one of the most heavily documented hauntings in American history, and one of the most disturbing. In the movie, these scenes are brought to life with terrifying realism. Walls shake. Lights flicker. And every time Carla tries to find peace, the entity returns, stronger, more violent, more cruel. Her body becomes a battlefield between faith, science, and the supernatural. Is she cursed? Is she delusional? Or has she truly become the victim of a force that defies everything we understand about the world? Director Sidney J. Furie doesn't just show horror, he builds it. Layer by layer. There's no blood, no monsters, only sound, silence, and the helplessness of a woman who can't fight what she can't see. Barbara Hershey's performance is hauntingly real. Her fear feels raw, her pain unbearable. You believe her, and that's what makes it terrifying. And perhaps the most chilling part? To this day, the case of Doris Bither has never been fully explained. Skeptics call it hysteria. Believers swear the photos and recordings prove the supernatural. But the truth remains in the shadows. The entity reminds us that not all horror lives in the dark corners of our imagination. Sometimes, it lives in the walls around us, watching, waiting, unseen. Because what's scarier than a monster you can't see is knowing it might be standing right beside you. 10. Wolf Creek, 2005, the Australian outback nightmare that was all too real. The outback, vast, sun-scorched, endless, a place where the horizon burns red and silence can feel like a scream. To most travelers, it's a land of freedom and adventure. But to others, it's the last place they were ever seen alive. Wolf Creek, 2005, is not just another horror movie. It's a descent into a real-life nightmare, one inspired by the true stories of backpackers who vanished in the remote Australian wilderness, never to return. What begins as a road trip of friendship and freedom soon becomes a brutal fight for survival. Far from the safety of civilization. The story follows Liz, Christy, and Ben, three carefree travelers exploring the vast emptiness of Western Australia. They laugh, drink, take photos, the kind of trip that feels infinite, the kind you never forget. But everything changes when their car mysteriously breaks down near a massive crater known as Wolf Creek, an ancient meteor site surrounded by haunting silence. As night falls and the temperature drops, they're stranded in the middle of nowhere. Then a stranger appears. Enter Mick Taylor, the rugged, charming, seemingly helpful Aussie local. He smiles, he jokes, he offers them help and warmth by his campfire. But behind that grin hides something primal, something that doesn't see them as people, but prey. What follows is a slow, methodical descent into pure terror. Mick isn't just a killer, he's a hunter who delights in the fear of his victims. He toys with them, mimics their voices, mocks their screams. Every frame of Wolf Creek feels raw, almost too real, the kind of horror that seeps into your bones because it could actually happen. The film's power comes from its realism. There are no supernatural monsters here, only human cruelty. Stripped bare and left to rot under the burning sun. Director Greg McLean based the film loosely on two chilling true events. The Ivan Milat backpacker murders of the 1990s, and the Bradley John Murdoch case of 2001, in which British tourist Peter Falconio disappeared without a trace. McLean took those fragments of reality and turned them into a cinematic nightmare, one that lingers long after the credits roll. The violence in Wolf Creek isn't stylized or exaggerated. It's raw, ugly, and disturbingly human. The camera doesn't flinch, and neither can you. You feel the dust, the sweat, the hopelessness as the victims realize that no one is coming to save them. The vastness of the Australian desert becomes its own character, an endless graveyard where screams disappear into the wind. What makes Wolf Creek so unforgettable isn't just its brutality, but its silence. The long stretches where nothing happens, where you can almost hear the fear breathing, that's where the movie grips you. Because it's not just about dying. It's about the waiting, the uncertainty, the realization that evil can look just like a friendly stranger. By the end, you're left shaken, not just by what happens, but by the knowledge that people like Mick Taylor have existed, and still do. The film ends with an unsettling calm, reminding us that monsters don't always hide under the bed. Sometimes, they wave from the side of the road, wearing a smile, asking if you need help. Wolf Creek isn't just horror. It's a warning. A reminder that sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that don't need ghosts, only men who have lost their humanity somewhere in the heat of the desert. So next time you're driving through the middle of nowhere, and a friendly stranger pulls up offering help, ask yourself, what would you do if the nightmare was real? They say the scariest stories are the ones that really happened. And after watching these 10 movies, you might start to believe that's true. From demonic possessions and haunted houses to killers who walked among us. These films remind us that horror doesn't always come from imagination, sometimes. It's ripped straight from the headlines. The Exorcism of Emily Rose. The Conjuring. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Girl Next Door. Each one blurs the line between cinema and nightmare. Between what we think is fiction and what might still be out there, waiting in the dark. These stories haunt because they could happen to anyone. A knock at the door. A voice in the night. A friendly stranger offering help. The moment you realize the real world can be just as terrifying as any horror movie. If you made it this far, you're brave. But before you turn off the lights, ask yourself, how much of what you've just seen was only a story, and how much was real? If you love exploring the dark side of cinema, the myths, the mysteries, the true horrors behind the screen, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets me bring you even more shocking, spine-chilling stories from the world of film. Because this is just the beginning. The next true horror might be closer than you think. And when it comes, you'll want to be here to see it first.